So I was asked a question, linked to a question on social media the other day that got me thinking. It made me want to address this in a video, and the question broadly ran along the lines, does religion make us happy? And if it does make us happy, ought we to be treating religion in a way that it really doesn't matter? Sort of Jordan Peterson-esque approach, that there's so much value to be had in religion and a religious society that we should all kind of just toe the line with it all and pretend that we believe it, even if we know that it's a load of old toss. So let me read you the question that was asked on social media, and then I'll sort of explain how I'm going to go about addressing it. If religion has a powerful placebo effect that helps people, should we seek to remove religion? Placebos are used in medicine all the time, although built on falsehoods. Falsehoods can be extremely effective in someone's well-being. Incorrect information can be extremely useful depending on its context. Most studies I've read have shown people who are religious to typically be happier than ones who aren't. Well, incorrect information might be helpful in some contexts, but it'd be useful to know if this is incorrect information. Are religious people typically happier than those who aren't? And if they are typically happier, are they happier because they're religious, or is there some confounding factor that's hidden within the statistics? And if we take on board the idea that religious people are happier, what then? Is that a logic that we would usually apply to things, to treat it in a particular way purely on the grounds of that? And if we do take that on board, what else could we apply it to, and how would we feel about it if we did that? Okay, so those are the things that I want to consider. The first thing then is simply to consider whether that is true. When he says most studies I've read have shown people who are religious to typically be happier than ones who aren't, is that the case? Well, what I thought I would have a look at is the United Kingdom, not just because I am blessed in having lived my life in this wonderful, wonderful nation, but also because it provides the perfect example for this, I think. A lot of people tend to go to the United States for their data, but you have a situation in the United States where 90% of people are religious, only 10% of the population are not religious. And we know from various surveys that the non-religious are held with a certain amount of distrust and indeed contempt in some quarters. So that could skew the way that people feel about themselves in terms of happiness. The situation is much more equal in the United Kingdom. I'll show you the data here. We have a roughly 50% of the population. As long as you don't go down the census lines and tie it into cultural affiliations, you have about 50% of people who claim to have a religion and 50% of the population who claim not to. You couldn't have a better situation, could you? Especially because other surveys have shown that we don't really hold people in contempt for having a religion or for not having a religion in the United Kingdom. We're fairly ambivalent about it either way. So what I did is I did a search to find out what claims have been made with regard to the United Kingdom. And duly, 2016 seemed to be the year where it hit the headlines in all the newspapers that religious people are happier than atheists. This was what was written in the Huffington Post, but it was in all the big newspapers as well. Official well-being statistics show religious people are happier than atheists, and then what the Huffington Post went through, as did all the others, showing us the happiness scores and showing us that those with no religion had the lowest score of anybody. This is really interesting, this, is that almost every article in every newspaper majored on two things, right? Of all the things in the data, it majored on the fact that religious people are happier than non-religious people, and that older people are happier than younger people. And in almost every case, they had people explaining the reasons why religion would make you happier, because you feel more certain about your future, or because you think that God is looking out for you, or because you think there's an afterlife or something like that. And also explaining why being older would make you happier, to do with, again, more security, more financial security as you're heading into or in retirement. You've got more free time. You know that your family's all set up okay. Maybe your house is paid for, all these different things. But I couldn't find a single person who tied the two things together, which is pretty shocking, really. I went to the ONS website and I pulled out the statistics, and here are the statistics. And duly, these stats are telling us exactly what the newspapers said they would say, which is that no religion, on the face of it, people of no religion are less happy than people of all the different religious categories there, with Hindus outscoring everybody. So presumably we should be promoting Hinduism and not Christianity. And then the age categories. Let me read down the age categories. The 16 to 19 seems to be something of an anomaly there, but let me read through all these age categories to you. I'll round them up or down. Listen to the trends: 7.6, 7.4, 7.4, 7.5, 7.3, 7.3, 7.2, 7.2, 7.3, 7.6, 7.8, 7.8, 7.7, 7.6, 7.6, 7.4. There seems to be a point there of 60 to 64, retirement age. Maybe that's significant, where suddenly people seem to be happier. So both these facts are reported in the paper, but not one single media source tied these two things together. And by Christ, if there's one thing they should have done, it's to tie these two things together, because we know how linked they are from the British Social Attitude Survey. Let me show you a cohort study from 2010 British Social Attitude Survey. You can see two things here. That as we go up through the cohorts, these are the cohorts to the side, these are the years where people were born. The more recently people were born, the more likely they are not to belong to a religion. And you can also see that people are holding that throughout their lives. It tends to remain pretty static. Duly, when we look elsewhere on the report, then what we see is that the younger people are, the less likely they are to have a religion. I propose to you that's a pretty damned significant thing to bear in mind. If you want to read those stats and say that, well, yes, religious people are happier than not religious people, you have to take into account the fact that the people who are 60 years and older are way more religious than the younger generations, and we know that the older generations, those 60-plussers, are way happier. So which is it, you know? Is it that older people are happier because they're more religious, or is it that religious people are happier because they tend to be older? We cannot tell from these statistics, but what we can tell is that one of the groups of arguments that were being made in these newspapers, either for the older people or for the religious people, are bunk, because one of those statistics is very strongly related to the other, and nobody was taking that into account. From my perspective, a little alarm bell rings that there seems to be that cliff edge at 60 to 64, which is right at the point where you retire. There's no equivalent cliff edge with regard to religiosity there, which makes me think that it's other factors relating to old age, such as the security of having your mortgage paid off, having your pension finalised so you know what you have coming in for the rest of your life, things such as that are making the difference, and not actually the religion of the person involved. That was the situation in the UK, and as I say, as you can see, the press gave a very, very false perspective on what was going on there, not disentangling the age factor with the religious factor. But what about the situation around the world? I must admit, I found this bit absolutely fascinating, because surely if religion played a decent part, there was a reasonable correlation between being religious and being happy, then we would find some of the most religious countries in the world amongst some of the happiest countries in the world. That some of these really, really zealous, devout countries, they'd just be jizzing their pants, would they not, with happiness on the back of their religiosity. But what I actually found was the exact opposite. Let me show you the data here. First, this is the World Happiness Index, which ranks happiness according to what they call the Cantrell ladder. They went to all the countries around the world and they asked this same question. They asked people to rate how they viewed their life. How good is their life based on a scale of 0 to 10, 0 being the worst possible life, 10 being the best possible life. That was what they did, and then they attempted to pick apart the various factors that were involved. Interestingly enough, they didn't even bother considering religion and religiosity, so they obviously didn't feel that there was going to be much of an effect with regard to that. But I'm not really interested in what they considered. I'm interested in the top 10. These are the top 10 happiest peoples in the world. I then had a look. Gallup in 2009 asked the question around the world, is religion important in your daily life? Thankfully for me, Wikipedia tabulated that data and allowed me to rearrange that table so that I could pick the country that had rated it the most unimportant first. Okay, so this is the interesting thing. Let me read you the top 10 countries with regard to happiness, and I'll tell you where they fall on that second chart with regard to regarding religion as unimportant in their daily life. Norway, 4th. Denmark, 2nd. Iceland actually wasn't on the list, unfortunately, anywhere. Switzerland, 24th. Finland, 9th. Netherlands, 13th. Canada, 25th. New Zealand, 14th. Australia, 12th. Sweden, 1st. So all 10 of the happiest nations in the world are amongst the least religious nations in the world. That is the exact opposite of what you would expect to see if religion was playing some significant role in making people happy. Now, let me be clear with what I'm not claiming here. I'm not overstretching myself here, and I'm not trying to suggest that these countries are all happier because they're not religious. I suspect that both these things, the happiness and the religiosity, are effects. One of them is not a cause and the other one an effect. That these are all prosperous Western nations with a well-developed welfare state, a high standard of living, a good life expectancy. And it's because of those things that people feel happy in terms of their life. And it's because of those things that have enabled people to become less religious. Their lives are not such a steaming pile of crap that they have to believe in something to try and help them get through the day. So I think that these are probably both effects rather than being a cause effect. But nevertheless, there is absolutely nothing here to suggest that it's being religious that is making people happier in any way around the world. But how about we just forget about all of that shite and let's just pretend for a moment that religion is making people significantly happier. What then? Well, I aim to tell you what then, or at least from my perspective, but to do so, I'm going to have to go and pick up that piece of paper that I've just thrown somewhat face-palmingly because the notes that I need are written on the other side, so just have to excuse me a minute while I go and grab that. Let's just pretend this part of the video never actually happened and we'll carry on. One thing that we know about happiness and evaluating happiness is that it is notoriously difficult to evaluate. And one of the reasons why it's notoriously difficult to evaluate is because it relates to our expectations in life, such as things get better, our baseline expectation increases and it takes more to make us happy. There was a famous study in 1978 that evaluated people that had lost one or more limbs, people who'd won a lottery, and a control group to evaluate their happiness down the line. What it found was that people who had won the lottery down the line were no happier than people who hadn't won the lottery, the control group. And the conclusion that was drawn from that is a conclusion that's been drawn several times since, is that effectively if you win the lottery, what happens is that your expectations increase. Initially you are able to achieve some happiness because you're able to do things that you always wanted to do that you couldn't afford to do before. But very soon those things start to become mundane. We take them for granted in much the same way as we were taking a different group of things for granted before. And the enjoyment we got from some of the things we're doing before, we just don't get anymore. So effectively we end up doing different things, but we take those things for granted in just the same way as we did before, and we end up no happier than we were before. It all sounds a bit depressing, really, doesn't it? Of course, there is an upside to it, which is that it works in the other way. If our life circumstance gets worse, things tend not to be quite as bad as we expect them to, because after the initial knock of not being able to do some of the things we could do before, we start to appreciate some things that we didn't appreciate before. It seems like there's some kind of internal levelling mechanism within us, and it's been suggested that maybe we're all kind of pre-programmed to a certain level of happiness to which we tend towards. And that life will hit us with various things, but we tend towards that level, and that level varies by individuals. So could it be, for example, that maybe even if religious people do tend to be happier, they're not happier because they're religious, but it could just be that people that have a tendency, a predisposition towards religiosity could also have a tendency, a predisposition towards a happier personality. It's certainly not beyond the realms of possibility. But what if despite all of this it could be shown that religion makes us happier? Would that justify us living the lie and perpetuating that lie for all of eternity on the grounds that humans just kind of need this to make them happy? Where else would we feel happy about that? Would we feel happy about it anywhere else? I tried to consider it in those terms because I found it objectionable, and no more or less objectionable than in these other circumstances that I could find, even though in these other circumstances it would have a beneficial effect on happiness and senses of security in our society. For example, with regard to crime. One thing that we know is that when people feel that crime levels are lower, they feel safer and they feel happier. And we know that people's perception of crime is not so much based upon actual crime levels in society, but the way in which crime is reported and detailed. If the government tells us that crime levels are going up, we feel that crime levels are going up. If the papers report that there's been a crime spree and that we're living in very, very violent times, then that is how we feel, even if that isn't true. Even if we're living in one of the safest, least crime-ridden ages in all of human history, we don't feel that because that isn't how it is reported. So perhaps the government should lie. Perhaps the government should lie for our benefit on crime statistics and claim that the police is having a wonderful job in clamping down on different forms of crime, and that robbery statistics, mugging statistics, rape statistics, murder statistics have all halved over the past 12 months and we're all way safer. It would definitely make us all feel better, but do we want the government to lie to us about this? I don't think anybody does. In actual fact. What about economic performance with regard to how we feel about our personal circumstance? We know that when we're told that we're in a recession, that times are getting hard, that is how we feel. It has a negative impact upon not just the confidence of businesses, but the confidence and the optimism of the average person on the street. We stop spending as much money in the shops. We start tightening our belts, metaphorically speaking, and we start to get anxious and concerned about these different things. So perhaps the government should lie about how the economy is performing, make up a set of stats to make out that everything is all wonderful and rosy in the garden, because then we'll all feel better and we'll feel happy about ourselves. I don't know anybody who has made that suggestion. Why are we making that suggestion with regard to religion, not with regard to crime stats, not with regard to economic stats, when we know that there is a tangible link between the report of economic well-being, the report of low crime rates, and our own personal happiness? The truth is that generally we don't evaluate things in society based on happiness. If we did, we'd ban alcohol and we'd legalise ecstasy. We'd ban the very social media that this person had used to post this point, because one thing that we do know is that social media isn't making people happy. In fact, quite the opposite. It's distressing people. People can't go 5 seconds without checking to see if somebody's saying something about them or something something's happening, right? It's having a real detrimental effect on our lives, but we're not banning that. We might even abandon democracy and give ourselves over to one-party rule, given how popular that is in China. Of course, I'm not seriously suggesting that we actually do any of these things any more than I was seriously suggesting that the government should cook up a set of statistics showing that the balance of trade deficit had disappeared overnight, or that burglary rates have fallen by 50% in the past 12 months. Why? Because this extends beyond, there are ramifications beyond just happiness and such as it is with religion. Religion is not the same as just a 5-year-old believing in Santa. It extends way beyond that. People are making their life decisions based upon their religious beliefs. Public policy is framed based upon people's religious convictions, and then everybody has to live by that, whether they believe in that religious tradition or not. And I find it kind of facile and absurd when religious people make this suggestion that, well, religious people are happier, so you should just be religious. If I was to say to a Christian in the United States who made that argument, have a look at these stats, Hindus are happier than you are you going to abandon Christianity and become a Hindu? They'd laugh in my face. Why? Because they genuinely believe what they believe. It's not so simple to just say, well, I'm going to start believing something just because it's going to make me happy. If you genuinely believe that the Abrahamic God exists and that Jesus is his son and also him, then that is what you believe. Right? You can't just convert to a different religion because it makes you happier. You can't just be religious because being religious would make you happier. The whole thing is absurd from the outset. What I wanted to do to wrap it up is to just make one thing clear, because the commenter had said this: should we seek to remove religion, effectively, if religious people are happy? Let me make one thing absolutely clear. I want to see religion diminish in Western societies. I would be pleased to see that for a variety of reasons that I've spelt out several times in the past. But that isn't about disabusing very religious people of their religion. I don't think that's a good thing to do, and I don't think it's necessary. I don't think it's a good thing to do because if you have grown up devoutly religious, it is true that there is a God-shaped hole within your thinking, and if you lose that religion, it does create something of a vacuum and it does cause people distress. If you're actively seeking to get involved in these discussions and questioning your own faith, well, then that's one thing. But I don't believe as an anti-theist it's my job to go out there and to make people unhappy, people who have grown up with the crutch of religion and who would feel it if those crutches were kicked from under them. That's the first thing. The second thing is there's no need to do that. We can see from the data. I showed you the cohort data for the United Kingdom. It's happening generation on generation. It's not that people are abandoning their religion. It's not that they're being actively disabused of their religion from mean-spirited anti-theists such as myself. It's just that each generation that comes along is less religious than the previous generation, and they don't suffer from this God-sized hole because they never had that crutch of a belief to begin with. Okay, that's pretty much all that I wanted to say about that. Interested to know your thoughts. Thanks for watching. Bye.